The knock came just after sunset. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 soft taps against the barn door, so faint Caleb Mercer almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. He stood motionless in the dim light of his lantern, one hand still gripping the pitchfork he'd been using to turn the hay. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the loose boards along the north wall. Could have been the wind, could have been a branch. Then it came again. 3 more taps, hesitant, almost apologetic. Caleb set the pitchfork down slowly, his jaw tightening. It was late November, 1867, and the nights in southern Wyoming had turned bitter. Anyone knocking this late either had nowhere else to go or was running from something. He crossed the barn floor, boots scraping against the dirt, and pulled the door open just enough to see outside. A woman stood in the threshold, her face half hidden beneath a torn shawl. Behind her, 2 children clung to her skirt, a boy no older than 6, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 4. Their clothes were threadbare, patched in a dozen places with mismatched fabric. The woman's hands were raw and cracked, her knuckles bleeding from the cold. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, eyes downcast, like she was waiting for permission to breathe. Caleb's throat tightened. "Please," she finally whispered. Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the wind. "Just one night, in the barn, we won't touch nothing, we'll be gone before sunrise." The boy looked up at him with wide, hollow eyes. The girl buried her face in her mother's side, shivering so hard her whole body trembled. Caleb's first instinct was to step back, to close the door, not out of cruelty, just caution. He'd heard stories, folks pretending to be desperate only to rob you blind the moment your back was turned. Others brought sickness, fever, disease that could wipe out a household in days. But the woman didn't move, didn't plead further. She just stood there, waiting for his answer, like she'd already accepted whatever he decided. "Where you coming from?" Caleb asked, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much these days, hadn't had reason to. "North," she said. "We've been walking 3 days." "Walking from where?" She hesitated. "Fort Laramie." Caleb's chest tightened. Fort Laramie was over 60 miles north. 3 days on foot, in this cold, with 2 small children. That wasn't desperation. That was survival. "What happened?" he asked. The woman's hands trembled as she pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My husband, he didn't come back from the railroad work. They said there was an accident, told me to clear out of the company housing by week's end." Her voice cracked. "I got nowhere to go, no family, nothing." The boy tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, I'm cold." She placed a hand on his head, smoothing down his hair. "I know, baby, I know." Caleb looked past them, out toward the darkening valley. The wind carried the scent of snow. Another storm was coming, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Either way, they wouldn't survive it out here. He should have said no, should have pointed them toward town, toward the church, toward anyone else who might take them in. But the words caught in his throat. Because when the woman finally looked up at him, he saw something in her face that made his stomach drop. It wasn't just exhaustion, it wasn't just fear. It was shame. The same kind of shame he'd seen in the mirror every morning for the past 8 years. "Just one night," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Please, we won't be no trouble." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and pulled the door open wider. "Come in," he said quietly. The woman's eyes widened. For a second, she didn't move, like she couldn't believe he'd said yes. Then she ushered the children inside, murmuring soft thanks under her breath. Caleb closed the door behind them and hung the lantern on a hook near the center post. The barn wasn't much, just hay bales, a few empty stalls, and the old plow horse he kept in the back. But it was warmer than the open plains, and the roof didn't leak. The woman sank down onto a pile of hay near the far wall, pulling the children close to her. The boy curled up against her side, and the girl whimpered softly, clutching a ragged cloth doll. Caleb stood near the door, arms crossed, watching them in the dim light. "There's a blanket in the back corner," he said, Might smell like horse, but it's clean. The woman nodded, thank you. He turned to leave, then stopped. You got food. She shook her head. Caleb exhaled slowly. I'll bring something. He walked out into the cold night air, his breath misting in front of him. The main house was just 50 yards away, a small, weathered cabin with a sagging porch and a chimney that barely drew smoke anymore. Inside, he moved through the motions without thinking: sliced bread, cold ham, a jar of preserves his neighbor had given him last summer. He wrapped it all in a cloth and grabbed an extra quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed. When he returned to the barn, the woman was singing softly to the children, a lullaby, low and mournful, the kind of song that carried more grief than comfort. She stopped when she saw him. Caleb set the food down beside her and draped the quilt over the children. The boy was already half asleep, his head resting in his mother's lap. The girl clutched the doll tighter, her eyes heavy. Eat, Caleb said, then get some rest. The woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. I don't know how to thank you. Don't, Caleb said, his voice flat. Just don't. He turned and walked back toward the door, but her voice stopped him. What's your name? He paused, one hand on the door frame. Caleb. I'm Mary, she said softly. This is Thomas and Lily. Caleb nodded once, then stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. The wind had picked up again, colder now. He stood there for a moment, staring out at the dark expanse of land stretching toward the horizon. Just one night, he told himself. One night and they'd be gone. But as he walked back toward the house, something gnawed at the edges of his mind, something he couldn't quite name. Because when Mary had looked up at him, when she'd whispered that quiet, desperate please, he'd seen something else in her face. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like she'd been waiting for him. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in the dark of his cabin, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace, listening to the wind scrape against the walls. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the window, toward the faint glow of the lantern still burning in the barn. Just one night. That's what she'd said. But something about the way she'd said it, something about the way she'd looked at him, made his chest feel tight. By dawn, he was already dressed. He pulled on his coat, grabbed the last of the coffee from the pot, and stepped outside into the cold gray light. The barn door was still closed. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. Maybe they were already gone. Maybe they'd slipped out before sunrise, just like she'd promised. But when he pulled the door open, they were still there. Mary sat upright against the hay bales, her arms wrapped around the children. Thomas was awake, staring at the floor. Lily still slept, her small body curled beneath the quilt. Mary looked up when Caleb entered. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. We'll go, she said quickly. We'll leave now. I needed to wait for her to wake up. Caleb didn't move. Where you headed? Mary's mouth opened, then closed. She looked away. I don't know. You got people, anyone's? No. Money. She shook her head. Caleb stood there, his jaw working. He should have let them go, should have wished them well and gone back to his life, but the words that came out weren't the ones he'd planned. Stay another day. Mary blinked. What? Stay, Caleb repeated, his voice rough. Just one more day. There's work needs doing around here. You help with that, I'll give you food, fair trade. Mary stared at him, her lips parted in disbelief. You don't have to. I know, Caleb said, but I'm offering. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she nodded slowly. All right. Caleb turned to leave, then stopped. There's a pump outside. Water's cold, but it's clean. I'll bring breakfast in an hour. He walked out before she could thank him again. By midday, Mary was mending a tear in the barn wall, while Thomas swept the floor with a broom twice his size. Lily sat in the corner, humming to her doll, her small voice echoing softly in the rafters. Caleb worked in silence, fixing the hinge on the back gate. Every so often, he'd glance over at Mary. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands steady despite the cold. "You done this kind of work before?" he asked. Mary nodded. "Grew up on a farm before I married." "Where's Missouri?" Caleb's chest tightened. "What part?" "Outside Independence." He went still. Mary didn't notice. She kept working, her fingers threading the rope through the torn slats. "My father had 40 acres, corn mostly, some cattle. We lost it after the war. Union troops came through, burned half the county, said we were harboring rebels." Her voice grew quieter. "We weren't, but it didn't matter." Caleb's hands went cold. "My father tried to fight them off," Mary continued. "They shot him in front of us. My mother, she couldn't take it, died the next winter. I was 16. She paused, tying off the rope. "That's when I met my husband. He promised me a new start, said we'd go west, build something together, and for a while, we did." Caleb's voice came out hoarse. "What was your father's name?" Mary looked up at him, surprised by the question. Elijah Brennan." The world tilted. Caleb took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. Elijah Brennan. Noun. He knew that name. He'd heard it shouted across a burning field 8 years ago, heard it screamed by a woman as soldiers dragged her husband into the dirt, heard it whispered in his own nightmares every night since. "You all right?" Mary asked, her brow furrowed. Caleb couldn't speak, couldn't move. Because he'd been there. He'd been one of the soldiers. It was 1859. Caleb was 19 years old, fresh-faced and hungry for purpose. He'd joined the Union forces because everyone else had, because it seemed like the right thing to do, because he didn't know any better. They'd been sent to Missouri to root out Confederate sympathizers, to burn supply lines, to make examples. Caleb's unit had come to the Brennan farm on a cold October morning. The captain, a man named Harding, had said there were rebels hiding there, that Brennan was feeding enemy soldiers, that they needed to send a message. But when they'd arrived, there was no one there except an older man, his wife, and a teenage girl. Harding hadn't cared. Caleb had stood in the yard, his rifle in his hands, watching as the captain ordered Brennan to his knees, watching as Brennan begged, watching as his wife screamed. And Caleb had done nothing. He'd been too afraid, too young, too paralyzed by the weight of the uniform on his back and the gun in his hands. When the shot rang out, Caleb had flinched, and when the girl, Mary, had collapsed over her father's body, sobbing, Caleb had turned away. He'd walked back to camp in silence, and he'd carried that silence ever since. "Caleb." Mary's voice pulled him back. He looked at her, his heart pounding. She was watching him, concern etched across her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Caleb swallowed hard. "I knew your father." Mary froze. "What?" "I was there," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "The day they came to your farm, I was one of them." The color drained from Mary's face. "I didn't pull the trigger," Caleb continued, his words coming faster now, "but I stood there, I watched, I did nothing to stop it." His voice broke. "I've lived with that every day since." Mary stared at him, her lips trembling. Then she stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You were there," she whispered. "You were there and you did nothing." "I know. You let them kill him." "I know." Her voice rose. "You let them burn everything we had." "I know," Caleb shouted, his voice raw. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to stop it. I'm sorry I walked away and let you suffer." He took a shaky breath. "I've been sorry every goddamn day of my life." Mary's eyes glistened with tears. "Sorry doesn't bring him back." "No," Caleb said quietly, "it doesn't." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Mary turned away, her shoulders shaking. Thomas stood in the corner, his eyes wide with fear. Lily had stopped humming. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. "If you want to leave, I won't stop you." Mary didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the wall, her hands trembling. Mary didn't leave. She didn't speak to Caleb either. For 3 days, they moved around each other like ghosts. Mary worked in silence, mending, cleaning, keeping the children occupied. Caleb stayed outside, chopping wood, fixing fences, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling. At night, he'd bring food to the barn and leave it by the door without a word. On the 4th morning, the rider came. Caleb was splitting logs behind the house when he heard the hoofbeats. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and watched as a lone figure crested the hill. The man rode slowly, deliberately. He wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and even from a distance, Caleb could see the glint of a badge on his chest. Sheriff Porter. Caleb's stomach tightened. Porter reined his horse to a stop just outside the fence line. He didn't dismount, just sat there, studying Caleb with cold, calculating eyes. Mercer, Porter said, his voice smooth as oil. Sheriff. Porter's gaze drifted toward the barn. Heard you got visitors. Caleb kept his expression neutral, just some folks passing through. That's so, Porter tilted his head. Funny, word around town is you got a woman and 2 kids holed up in your barn. Been here near a week now. 4 days, Caleb corrected. Porter smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. That's still long enough to raise questions. Questions about what? About why you're harboring vagrants, Porter said. About whether they're diseased. About whether they're stealing from you, he paused, or whether they're stealing from someone else. Caleb's jaw tightened. They're not stealing anything. You sure about that? I'm sure. Porter's smile widened. See, the thing is, Mercer, I got a telegram 2 days ago from the railroad company up in Fort Laramie. Said one of their workers died in an accident a few weeks back, left behind a widow and 2 kids. Said the widow owed the company for housing, food, medical care. He leaned forward in his saddle, said she ran off before she could pay. Caleb's blood ran cold. That wouldn't be the same woman you're letting sleep in your barn, would it? Porter asked. She doesn't owe them anything, Caleb said, his voice hard. Her husband died working for them. They don't get to charge her for that. Porter shrugged. Company says otherwise. The company's wrong. Maybe, Porter said, but that's not for you to decide. He swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He walked toward the barn, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Caleb stepped in front of him. She's not going anywhere. Porter stopped, his eyes narrowing. You really want to do this, Mercer? I'm not letting you take her. Porter studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled again, cold and predatory. You know what I think? I think you're sweet on her. I think you're letting your judgment get clouded by a pretty face and a sob story. Think what you want, Caleb said, but she's staying. Porter's hand moved to his gun. Step aside, Mercer. Caleb didn't move. The barn door creaked open. Mary stepped out, her face pale but resolute. Thomas and Lily clung to her skirt, their eyes wide with fear. It's all right, Mary said quietly. I'll go. No, Caleb said. Mary looked at him, her expression unreadable. I don't want trouble for you. You're not trouble. Porter laughed. Ain't that sweet? He gestured toward his horse. Come on, lady, time to go. Mary took a step forward, but Caleb blocked her path. She's not going, he repeated. Porter's smile faded. You're making a mistake, Mercer. Wouldn't be my first. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other. The wind picked up, rattling the fence posts. Then Porter's hand twitched toward his gun. And a voice called out from the road. Porter! Caleb turned. A wagon rolled into view, driven by an older man with a graying beard and a weathered face. Behind him, 3 more riders followed, local ranchers Caleb recognized from town. The older man climbed down from the wagon, his movements slow but deliberate. His name was Eli Dawson, and he'd owned the land next to Caleb's for the past 20 years. What's going on here? Dawson asked, his tone measured. Porter straightened. Ranch business, Dawson, nothing to do with you. When you're threatening my neighbor, it becomes my business, Dawson said. He looked at Caleb. Everything all right, Mercer? Caleb nodded. Sheriff was just leaving. Porter's jaw clenched. I've got a legal claim here, Dawson. That woman owes money to the railroad company. Does she now? Dawson crossed his arms. And what proof do you have? Porter hesitated. I got a telegram. A telegram, Dawson repeated, from a company that works men to death and calls it an accident. He spat into the dirt. That doesn't sound like a legal claim to me. Sounds like extortion. One of the riders behind Dawson nodded. Sounds right. Porter's face reddened. You're interfering with official business. No, Dawson said. I'm making sure you don't abuse your authority. He glanced at Mary. This woman ain't done nothing wrong, and if you try to take her, you'll have to go through all of us. The other men moved forward, their horses forming a loose line between Porter and the barn. Porter looked around, his hand still resting on his gun, but he was outnumbered and he knew it. He exhaled sharply, then swung back onto his horse. This isn't over, Mercer. Yeah, Caleb said quietly, it is. Porter spurred his horse and rode off, dust kicking up behind him. Dawson watched him go, then turned to Caleb. You all right? Caleb nodded. Thanks, Eli. Dawson shrugged. Couldn't let Porter run roughshod over folks just because he wears a badge. He glanced at Mary. You need anything, you let us know. Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Dawson tipped his hat, then climbed back onto his wagon. The other riders followed, and soon they were gone, leaving only silence in their wake. Caleb turned to Mary. You all right? She wiped her eyes. I don't understand. Why did they help? Caleb looked toward the road, where the dust was still settling, because some folks still remember what it means to stand for something. So let me ask you something. If you were standing in Caleb's boots, would you have opened that door? Would you have let the past stay buried, or would you have faced it head-on, knowing it might cost you everything? Take a breath, think about that. If you're still with me, let me know what time it is where you are right now. And if this story's pulling you in, tap subscribe so you don't miss how this turns out. Because what happens next, it's where everything changes. The days that followed were different. Mary still didn't talk much, but the silence between them had shifted, less sharp, less heavy, like something had cracked open just enough to let a little light through. Carl. Leb worked alongside her in the mornings, repairing the barn roof, patching holes in the walls. Mary proved to be stronger than she looked. She climbed the ladder without hesitation, hammered nails with steady hands, and never complained about the cold. Thomas helped too, fetching tools and holding boards in place. Lily stayed close to her mother, singing softly to her doll. One afternoon, while Caleb was nailing a board into place, Mary spoke. Why didn't you leave? She asked. Caleb paused, the hammer halfway to the nail. What? After the war, Mary said. Why didn't you leave? Go somewhere else. Start over. Caleb lowered the hammer, tried to, got as far as Kansas before I realized it didn't matter where I went. I'd still be carrying the same weight. Mary was quiet for a moment. So you came here. Bought this land with what little I had left, Caleb said. Figured if I couldn't outrun it, I'd at least try to live with it. Does it work? Caleb looked at her. No. Mary's lips twitched, not quite a smile but close. At least you're honest. They worked in silence for a while longer, then Mary spoke again. I hated you, she said quietly. When you told me who you were, I hated you so much I couldn't breathe. Caleb nodded. I know. But then I watched you, Mary continued. Watched the way you looked at my children, the way you brought us food every night, even when I wouldn't look at you, the way you stood in front of that sheriff like you'd take a bullet before you'd let him take us. She paused, and I realized something. What? You hate yourself more than I ever could. Caleb's throat tightened. Mary climbed down from the ladder, brushing dust from her hands. I'm not saying I forgive you, I don't know if I ever will, but, she looked at him, her eyes softer now, I think you've been punishing yourself long enough. Caleb didn't know what to say. Mary picked up another board and handed it to him. Come on, roof's not going to fix itself. That evening, Caleb brought dinner to the barn as usual, stew this time, thick with vegetables and chunks of salted beef. But instead of leaving it at the door, he stepped inside. Mary looked up, surprised. Thought I'd eat with you tonight, Caleb said, if that's all right. Mary hesitated, then nodded, all right. They sat together near the lantern, bowls balanced on their laps. Thomas and Lily ate hungrily, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. Lily hummed between bites, a soft, tuneless melody. She always sing like that? Caleb asked. Mary smiled faintly. Since she was a baby, her father used to say she was born with music in her bones. What was he like? Mary's smile faded. Kind, gentle, he worked hard, never complained. He loved those kids more than anything. Her voice cracked. He didn't deserve to die like that. No, Caleb said quietly, he didn't. They ate in silence for a while. Then Thomas looked up at Caleb. Are you a soldier? The boy asked. Caleb's chest tightened. I was, long time ago. Did you fight bad guys? Caleb set his bowl down, his hands trembling. I thought I was, but sometimes it's hard to tell who the bad guys are. Thomas frowned, clearly confused. Mary placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Finish your stew, Thomas. The boy obeyed, and the conversation drifted into lighter territory, talk of weather, of chores, of small everyday things that didn't carry the weight of the past. When the meal was finished, Caleb stood to leave, but before he reached the door, Mary called out to him. Caleb. He turned. Mary was standing now, her hands clasped in front of her. Thank you for everything. Caleb nodded. You don't have to thank me. Yes, Mary said, I do. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Caleb stepped out into the cold night, closing the door softly behind him. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of laughter. He stepped outside and saw Thomas running through the yard, chasing a stray chicken that had escaped from the coop. Lily was clapping her hands, giggling as the bird squawked and flapped its wings. Mary stood near the barn, watching them with a faint smile on her face. Caleb walked over to her. They seem happy. They are, Mary said, first time in weeks. Caleb watched the children for a moment. What are you going to do after this? Mary's smile faded. I don't know, find work I suppose, somewhere the railroad company can't reach us. You could stay, Caleb said. Mary looked at him, surprised. What? Stay here, Caleb repeated. There's work, the land's not much but it's enough, and, he hesitated, you'd be safe. Mary stared at him, her eyes searching his face. Why are you doing this? Because I owe you, Caleb said. Because I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can make sure you and your kids don't have to keep running. Mary's lips trembled. You don't owe me anything. Yes, Caleb said quietly, I do. For a long moment, Mary didn't speak. Then she nodded slow. WLY, all right. Caleb blinked, all right. We'll stay, Mary said, for now. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was clenched so tight. All right, he said. And for the first time in 8 years, Caleb Mercer smiled. The weeks that followed carried a rhythm Caleb had almost forgotten, the rhythm of shared labor, of voices filling the silence, of meals eaten together instead of alone. Mary proved herself capable in ways that surprised him. She knew how to stretch supplies, how to salt meat to last through winter, how to read the sky for coming storms. Thomas grew bolder, helping Caleb with the animals, learning to mend tack and curry the horse. Lily's singing became a constant presence, drifting through the barn and across the yard like a thread of warmth. Caleb built a small room onto the side of the barn, 4 walls, a door, a window that let in morning light. It wasn't much, but it was warmer than sleeping in the open hay. He hung a quilt to separate the children's sleeping space from Mary's and brought in a small stove he'd salvaged from the back shed. Mary protested at first. "You're doing too much." "I'm doing what's needed," Caleb said. She studied him for a long moment, then she nodded, "Thank you." One afternoon in early December, Eli Dawson rode up again, this time with his wife beside him. They brought a basket of canned goods, a sack of flour, and a hand-stitched quilt. "Heard you had extra mouths to feed," Mrs. Dawson said, handing the basket to Mary. "Figured you could use some help." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say nothing," Mrs. Dawson replied. "Just take it." Over the next few days, others came too. A neighbor brought firewood. Another left a box of winter clothes, too small for his own children, but perfect for Thomas and Lily. The blacksmith in town sent word that if Caleb needed any tools repaired, he'd do it for free. "Why are they doing this?" Mary asked one evening, standing beside Caleb as they watched the sun sink below the hills. "Because they remember what it's like to need help," Caleb said, "and because they know what it means to give it." Mary looked at him. "You told them about me, about what happened." "I told Dawson," Caleb admitted. "He told a few others, folks around here. They don't take kindly to men who abuse their power. Porter made himself an enemy when he tried to take you." Mary shook her head slowly. "I never thought I'd find people like this again." "Neither did I," Caleb said quietly. By January, the worst of the winter had settled in. Snow piled high against the barn walls, and the wind howled through the valley like a living thing. But inside, the small room Caleb had built stayed warm. Mary spent her evenings mending clothes by lamplight. Thomas practiced his letters on scraps of paper Caleb had brought from town. Lily sang to her doll, rocking it gently in her arms. One night, after the children had fallen asleep, Mary and Caleb sat by the stove, the fire crackling softly between them. "I've been thinking," Mary said. Caleb looked up. "About what?" "About staying, not just for the winter, but longer." Caleb's heart beat a little faster. "You mean that?" "I do," Mary said, "if you'll have us." "I'd like that," Caleb said quietly. Mary smiled, small but real. "So would I." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them. Then Mary spoke again, her voice softer now. "I don't think I can ever forget what happened, what they did to my father, what you didn't do." "I know," Caleb said. "But I don't want to carry that weight anymore," Mary continued. "I don't want my children to grow up in the shadow of it." She looked at him. "So I'm choosing to let it go, not because you deserve it, but because I do." Caleb's throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mary said. "Just keep being the man you are now, not the boy you were." Caleb nodded, his eyes burning. "I'll try." Mary reached out and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, tentative, but steady. And for the first time in 8 years, Caleb didn't pull away. Spring came slowly, but it came. The snow melted. The fields turned green. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence line, bright and stubborn. Mary planted a garden beside the barn, carrots, beans, squash. Thomas helped dig the rows, and Lily scattered seeds with her small hands, laughing as the dirt smudged her fingers. Caleb watched them from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands. He'd never imagined this, never thought his life could hold something other than guilt and silence. But here it was, real and breathing and alive. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mary walked over to where Caleb stood. "Thank you," she said. Caleb glanced at her. "For what?" "For opening the door," Mary said. "That first night, you could have said no, most people would have." "I almost did," Caleb admitted. Mary smiled. "But you didn't." They stood together in the fading light, watching as Thomas chased Lily through the tall grass, their laughter echoing across the valley. "They're happy," Mary said softly. So are you, Caleb said. Mary looked at him, her eyes bright. So are you. Caleb didn't argue because it was true. For the first time in 8 years, Caleb Mercer was happy. Years later, people in the valley would talk about the rancher who'd taken in a widow and her children. Some said it was charity, others said it was guilt. A few whispered it was redemption. But those who knew Caleb, really knew him, understood the truth. It wasn't about what he owed. It was about what he chose. And that choice, made on a cold November night when 3 soft knocks broke the silence, had changed everything. The barn still stood, weathered but strong. The garden still grew, season after season. And on quiet evenings, if you listened close, you could still hear the faint sound of a little girl singing, a melody passed down through years, carried on the wind like a promise. That some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some lives, once changed, can never go back.